Grandpa's will left me just one rusty key. It opened a fortune no one knew existed. The first thing my grandfather left me was humiliation. The second was a key. It lay inside a velvet box on the attorney's table, brown with rust and tied to a paper tag by a piece of faded blue string. My cousins had received houses, investment accounts, vehicles, and shares in the family company. My mother had received the lake property she had been asking for since I was 16. My uncle had been given the downtown building where his restaurants operated. When my name was finally read, the room had already distributed more than $12 million in its imagination. Then the attorney pushed the little box toward me and said my inheritance consisted of one iron key and whatever it opened. My cousin Derek laughed before he could stop himself. His sister Caroline lowered her face, but I saw her smiling into her hand. My mother stared at the box as if I had embarrassed her by receiving it. Only my Aunt Vivian looked uneasy. She asked the attorney whether there had been a mistake. There had not. Grandpa had added one instruction. I was to identify the lock without professional assistance, without selling or transferring the key, and without allowing another beneficiary to take possession of it. If I failed within 30 days, whatever the key controlled would pass into the residual estate and be divided among the family. That condition transformed the laughter into interest. I closed my hand around the key. Rust flaked onto my palm like dried blood. I did not know what it opened, but I knew my grandfather well enough to understand that he had not chosen me accidentally. He had taught me to repair clocks, balance ledgers, and recognize when a person wanted an answer more than they wanted the truth. He had also spent the final 6 months of his life pretending not to recognize me whenever my relatives were in the room. At the time, I thought the dementia had taken him. Sitting in that office, I began to wonder whether the performance had been for my protection. My name is Nora Vale. I was 32 when Elias Vale died, and by then I had spent most of my life being the least impressive member of an impressive family. Vale & Sons began as a hardware store in 1958 and grew into a regional construction supply empire. Grandpa appeared in newspaper photographs with governors, donated wings to hospitals, and owned enough property that family dinners often turned into informal zoning meetings. My uncle Raymond ran the company. Derek was a vice president. Caroline managed the family foundation. My mother, Elaine, called herself a cultural consultant, which meant she organized charity events using money other people had earned. I restored archival documents for a city museum. My relatives treated my work as an eccentric hobby that had somehow acquired health insurance. Grandpa did not. He understood the satisfaction of bringing something damaged back without erasing the evidence of age. When I was a child, he let me sit behind the counter of the original hardware store, long after it had become a private family archive. He would hand me corroded hinges and broken measuring tools and ask what they had been made to do. He believed every object retained the shape of its purpose. The key was 7 inches long, too large for a modern door and too plain for a ceremonial lock. Its bow was oval, its shaft hollow, and its bit had 3 uneven steps. One side bore a shallow mark that looked like the number 11, although corrosion had swallowed part of it. It smelled faintly of oil beneath the rust. By the time I left the attorney's office, everyone wanted a closer look. My mother followed me into the parking garage and said we should handle the search together. She used the word we the way she always did when I possessed something she considered temporarily misplaced. Raymond offered access to the company records. Derek suggested posting photographs online and crowdsourcing an answer. Caroline reminded me that 30 days was not much time and said she would hate to see Grandpa's final gift wasted because I was too proud to accept help. Their concern would have been touching if they had shown any before learning the deadline. I put the box inside my bag and told them I needed time. Derek stepped closer and said the residual clause made the key everyone's business. For 1 second, his friendly expression disappeared. I saw calculation underneath it, clean and cold. Then the garage elevator opened and he smiled again. That evening, my mother invited the family to the lake house she had inherited and called it a memorial dinner. Grandpa had been buried 4 days earlier. She had already hired a decorator to measure the bedrooms. I did not go. Instead, I sat on the floor of my apartment with photocopies of the will, the key under a magnifying lamp, and every photograph I had taken inside Grandpa's properties over the previous decade. I compared locks on the farm gates, storage barns, display cabinets, warehouse offices, and the old hardware store. Nothing matched. Most had modern cylinders. The key belonged to an older lever lock, likely late 19th or early 20th century, but Grandpa had acquired dozens of old buildings. 30 days was generous if he expected me to think. It was cruel if he expected me to search every door. Near midnight, I noticed the blue string. Grandpa used blue cotton cord to bind packets of family letters in the archive. He could have attached the tag with anything, but he had chosen the same material. On the tag, beneath my name, the attorney had copied a line from Grandpa's handwritten instructions, "For the girl who remembered what things were made to do." It was something he had said in the original store. The building stood on Mercer Street between a pawn shop and an abandoned theater. Vail & Sons had moved its headquarters decades earlier, but Grandpa refused to sell the narrow brick property. The ground floor remained arranged like a 1960s hardware shop, complete with wooden drawers of nails and a brass cash register. The upper floors held ledgers, catalogs, deeds, and construction plans. After Grandpa's health declined, Raymond changed the alarm code and restricted access, claiming the building created liability. At 7 the next morning, I drove there. A new electronic lock had been installed on the front entrance. My key did not fit. I walked around the alley and found the loading door reinforced by a steel bar. The basement windows were bricked over. Through the dusty glass in front, the store looked undisturbed, but a small red light blinked beside the ceiling. Raymond had not merely secured an unused archive, he had turned it into a monitored vault. I called him from the sidewalk and asked for access. He sounded delighted by my request. He said he would meet me that afternoon, then added that Derek should accompany us because 2 witnesses would prevent misunderstandings. I declined. The will prohibited allowing another beneficiary to take possession of the key, not their presence, but Grandpa had written the condition carefully. If he wanted the family watching me, he would have said so. Raymond's delight vanished. He informed me that the building belonged to Vail & Sons, and I could not enter without authorization. I reminded him that he had just offered authorization. He said circumstances had changed. They had changed in less than 20 seconds, which told me I was looking in the right place. I spent the afternoon at the county records office. The Mercer Street building did not belong to Vail & Sons. It belonged to an entity called 11 Mercer Holdings, created in 1974. The registered agent was dead. The mailing address led to a post office box that had been closed for years. Tax payments came from a trust account whose name was hidden behind an attorney-client designation. The number 11 on the key no longer looked accidental. I searched building permits. The original structure had been renovated in 1902, 1927, and 1959. A set of microfilmed plans from the 1927 renovation showed a freight lift running from the basement to the 3rd floor. Modern plans showed only stairs. Between 2 sheets, someone had inserted a note about a fireproof records chamber beneath the rear loading bay. The chamber did not appear on later drawings. At closing time, a clerk named Luis helped me enlarge the faded plan. The chamber could only be reached through the basement, but its entry was not drawn as a conventional doorway. Beside it was a small rectangle marked S11. I felt the key through the fabric of my bag. When I returned home, my apartment door was unlocked. Nothing obvious had been stolen. My laptop remained on the desk. Jewelry sat untouched. The velvet box was still inside my bag because I had carried it with me. But the photographs on my floor had been rearranged, and the copy of Grandpa's will was open to the page describing the key. Someone had searched quickly and wanted me to know it. I called the police. The officer found scratches near the latch, but no usable prints. He asked whether any family member had a spare. My mother did. I had given it to her after surgery 2 years earlier and never requested it back. She answered on the first ring and sounded offended before I accused her of anything. She said she had been at the lake house with 6 people all day. Then she asked whether the key was safe. I had not told her what had been disturbed. That night I placed the key in a safe deposit box at my bank and photographed it from every angle. I also emailed the attorney, Mara Whitcomb, documenting the break-in and asking whether Grandpa had left any further guidance. Her response arrived at 2:13 a.m. She wrote that she could not expand the instructions, but she could clarify one point. Identifying the lock was not the same as opening it. I would satisfy the condition by delivering a written identification to her office. If correct, additional arrangements would follow. Grandpa had anticipated that the door might be inaccessible. More importantly, he had created a way for me to continue without bringing the key near my family. I sent Mara my conclusion. The key opened secured compartment 11 in the concealed records chamber beneath the original Vail & Sons store at 114 Mercer Street. Her reply contained only an appointment time and the address of a private bank. The following morning, Mara met me in the bank's conference room with another attorney, a security officer, and a sealed envelope bearing Grandpa's signature. She confirmed I had identified the lock on day 2. Then she explained that the Mercer Street chamber had been emptied 18 months earlier. Grandpa had moved its contents after someone attempted to access it using company contractors. The key was authentic, but it now served as proof of completion and as a symbol he believed I would understand. The envelope contained a letter. Grandpa wrote that wealth attracted people who confused possession with stewardship. He had spent his final years watching our family become experts at the first and failures at the second. The key had once opened a records cabinet in the hidden chamber. What waited for me now was safer, larger, and far more dangerous than cash. Before I could receive it, I had to decide whether I wanted the burden. The attorneys placed 3 binders on the table. The first documented a trust called the Mercer Restoration Trust. The second contained ownership records for 42 commercial properties across 3 states. The third held patents, royalty agreements, mineral leases, and private company shares. Based on conservative valuations, the assets were worth at least $87 million. I read the number 3 times. The fortune did not belong to Grandpa's estate. It had never appeared on any family financial statement. It belonged to the trust, whose sole successor trustee was me. There was no celebratory moment, no burst of music, no sudden sense that my life had become easy. I felt the room tilt slightly, then steady. $87 million was not a prize. It was a landscape. I could not see its borders. Mara gave me water and explained the history. In 1974, Vail & Sons was close to bankruptcy. A recession had frozen construction. Grandpa's older brother Samuel wanted to liquidate. Their bookkeeper, a woman named Ruth Mercer, designed a restructuring plan that saved the company. She convinced suppliers to exchange debt for future royalties, acquired distressed properties through a separate holding company, and used rental income to stabilize payroll. Ruth was not merely an employee. She was Grandpa's business partner, although the culture of the time and Samuel's pride kept her name off the storefront. Ruth died in 1981. She had no children. Her will placed her interests into a trust with Grandpa as trustee and directed that the assets be used for employees, historic preservation, and community businesses. Grandpa added his separate holdings over the years. He kept the trust outside the family company because Samuel, then Raymond, repeatedly tried to treat every pool of money as available capital. The trust had grown quietly for 5 decades. My grandfather had not created the fortune alone, and that was the first secret. The second was that Vail & Sons owed the trust $34 million. Raymond had borrowed against trust properties through a series of unauthorized guarantees. He disguised the transactions as intercompany agreements, assuming Grandpa's declining health would prevent scrutiny. The money funded expansion, covered operating losses, and financed distributions that allowed the family to maintain the appearance of success. The company celebrated record revenue while quietly consuming collateral it did not own. Grandpa discovered the scheme 2 years earlier. Rather than expose it immediately, he began collecting evidence. He amended the trust, moved the records, and arranged for an independent forensic audit. He also documented repeated attempts by Raymond and Derek to have him declared incompetent. The dementia had been real but intermittent. The performance had hidden the lucid periods in which he fought back. I asked why he had chosen me. Mara opened the final binder. Inside were copies of preservation reports I had written for the museum, letters I sent Grandpa, and photographs of the original store's archive. There were also notes in his handwriting. Nora, repairs before she replaces. Nora distinguishes age from damage. Nora knows custody is not ownership. On the last page he had written, "She is the only one who may hate this enough to do it honestly." That sentence broke something in me. For years I had believed Grandpa respected my work, but regretted my lack of ambition. My mother had often translated his silences for me, explaining that he wished I would join the company or pursue something more substantial. Yet he had been studying the principles behind my quiet life and deciding they were the qualifications for his largest responsibility. Mara said I had 72 hours to accept or decline the trusteeship. If I declined, a professional institution would assume control. I would receive a modest bequest of $50,000, and the family would likely never learn the trust existed unless the debt required enforcement. If I accepted, I would owe fiduciary duties to beneficiaries that included current employees, retired workers, preservation projects, and a small business lending fund. I could not treat the fortune as my personal account. I would receive a salary and limited discretionary distributions, but every major action would be audited. I would also inherit the obligation to decide what to do about Vail & Sons. Grandpa had left my relatives assets. He had left me a choice capable of taking those assets away. I accepted. My first official act was to hire independent counsel. My second was to instruct Mara not to notify the family until we secured the records and froze any further unauthorized borrowing. My third was to take unpaid leave from the museum rather than resign. I needed one part of my life that had not been rearranged by a dead man's plan. For 4 days, I lived between conference rooms. The audit revealed that Vale & Sons was less than 6 months from a liquidity crisis. Raymond's expansion into luxury developments had failed. Derek had approved supplier contracts with a company secretly owned by his college roommate, inflating costs by millions. Caroline's foundation had used corporate funds for events that doubled as personal vacations. My mother had borrowed against the lake house before the estate transfer was complete, based on a letter Raymond provided promising clear title. Every inheritance announced in the attorney's office rested on unstable ground. The trust could demand immediate repayment and collapse the company. It could extend the loans and allow the misconduct to continue. Or it could convert the debt into controlling equity, remove management, and preserve the jobs of nearly 900 employees. Grandpa's documents favored the third option, but he had not ordered it. He wanted the decision to be mine. On the 6th day after the will reading, Raymond invited me to dinner at the lake house. The message said the family wanted to apologize for laughing. By then, I knew he had received inquiries from the trust's audit firm. He did not know I controlled it, but he understood that the key had led me somewhere. I went because avoiding the family would give them space to invent a story. The lake house looked different without Grandpa. My mother had removed his worn leather chair and replaced it with 2 white sofas nobody was allowed to sit on while holding red wine. His photographs were stacked in the hallway. A contractor had marked walls for demolition. Grief had not slowed possession for even a week. Everyone from the will reading was there. Their friendliness felt rehearsed. Caroline poured my favorite wine. Derek asked about the museum. Vivian hugged me too long and whispered that I should be careful. Raymond waited until dinner was served before asking what I had found. I told him the key had opened an old records cabinet. That was technically true. He asked what was inside. I said documents. Derek wanted to know whether they had financial value. My mother interrupted and insisted Grandpa would never hide money from the family. The certainty in her voice suggested she had spent days fearing exactly that. I said I was still reviewing the material. Raymond leaned back and explained that old business documents could be misunderstood without context. He offered the company's legal team. When I declined, he said Grandpa had become paranoid near the end and had accused loyal people of absurd things. The table fell quiet. For years, the family had used Grandpa's dementia as a curtain. Now Raymond was trying to pull it across the room before I described what stood behind it. I asked, what sort of absurd things? He said Grandpa had imagined that the company owed money to entities that no longer existed. I had never mentioned a debt. Derek looked at his father. Caroline stopped moving her fork. My mother stared at me with a warning I had seen since childhood. Do not ask the question that makes the room unpleasant. So I asked another. I wanted to know why Raymond had sent contractors into the Mercer Street basement 18 months earlier. He denied doing it. I described the invoices bearing Derek's approval code. Derek claimed the work involved mold inspection. I explained that the contractors specialized in vault removal. The denial shifted shape. Raymond said the building belonged to the company, and he had every right to protect its property. I told him 11 Mercer Holdings owned the building. For the first time that evening, Raymond looked afraid. My mother ordered me to stop interrogating my uncle. She said Grandpa had barely known his own name when those records were created. I asked how she knew when they had been created. Her face changed. It was a small change, but archivists build careers on small differences. She knew about the chamber. The truth emerged slowly over the next week, not because anyone confessed, but because fear made them careless. Vivian called me the morning after dinner and asked to meet privately. She had been Grandpa's youngest child, and the only one who never worked for Vale & Sons. She told me that when they were teenagers, Elaine and Raymond sometimes followed Grandpa to Mercer Street. They knew there was a locked basement room and believed he kept emergency cash there. 3 years earlier, my mother found an old building plan while helping him move papers. She gave it to Raymond. Raymond hired contractors to breach the chamber. They reached the cabinet but found it empty. Grandpa had moved the most valuable records days earlier after Vivian warned him. Vivian had not known what the records controlled. She only knew her siblings had become obsessed. When Grandpa's memory worsened, Raymond pressured his doctor and tried to obtain a broad power of attorney. My mother supported the petition. They told the rest of us it was routine estate planning. I remembered Grandpa failing to recognize me at Thanksgiving. Raymond had been watching from the doorway. Later, when I helped Grandpa to his room, he gripped my wrist and whispered, "Not all broken things need fixing in front of witnesses." I thought it was the dementia talking. He had been warning me. The family learned I controlled the trust on day 11. Our attorneys delivered a notice of default to Vale & Sons and offered a 30-day standstill if the board appointed an independent restructuring officer. The notice identified me as successor trustee. My phone began ringing before the courier left company headquarters. Raymond called 9 times. Derek sent messages alternating between threats and affection. Caroline wanted to meet woman to woman. My mother left a voicemail saying I had stolen my grandfather's legacy. The same people who mocked a rusty key now described its contents as something that had always belonged to them. I did not respond until our council scheduled a formal family meeting. We met in the Vale & Sons boardroom beneath a portrait of Grandpa painted when he was 50. Raymond sat in his usual chair. I sat across from him with Mara, forensic accountant Daniel Cho, and restructuring specialist Isabel Reed. The board included 3 independent directors, though I soon learned independent meant socially connected enough to attend Raymond's Christmas parties. Daniel presented the debt, unauthorized guarantees, conflicted supplier contracts, and insolvency projections. He did not dramatize. Numbers are often most devastating when read in a neutral voice. Raymond called the trust a fiction created by a confused man. Mara produced formation documents from 1974 and 50 years of audited statements. Derek argued the company had effectively managed the properties. Daniel showed that the trust had repeatedly paid the company market-rate fees for legitimate services. Caroline said the family's charitable work proved their stewardship. Mara displayed foundation charges for a private yacht, designer clothing, and a birthday event in Monaco categorized as donor cultivation. My mother said nothing until the independent directors began discussing suspension of management. Then she turned to me and asked how much I wanted. The question revealed everything she believed about me. She could imagine injury, responsibility, and even legality only as disguises for a price. If I named a number, she could reduce my refusal to years of jealousy finally becoming expensive. I told her I wanted the company to survive without feeding on assets meant for other people. Raymond insisted the trust would destroy 900 jobs if it enforced the debt. I reminded him those workers were trust beneficiaries. That was why we had offered a restructuring instead of liquidation. Our proposal converted most of the debt into 71% of company equity. Raymond and Derek would resign. Caroline would repay misused foundation funds under a confidential settlement or face referral to authorities. The remaining family shareholders would keep reduced interests, but distributions would stop until the company met solvency targets. No inherited real estate connected to the estate would be used as collateral during the review. Raymond called it theft. I placed a copy of the unauthorized guarantees in front of him and said theft had already occurred. He rejected the proposal. That evening, he arranged for the company to transfer $6 million to a newly created subsidiary. The transaction triggered controls our forensic team had installed. The bank froze the wire. By morning, 2 independent directors had resigned, and our counsel sought an emergency injunction. The story reached the press before lunch. The first headlines portrayed a family feud over a mysterious inheritance. A photograph of me leaving court appeared beside an old Society page image of Caroline. Commenters decided I was either a heroic granddaughter or an obscure museum worker manipulated by aggressive lawyers. Neither description felt like me. I stopped reading after an article called "The Key, a Fairy Tale Object," and estimated my personal fortune at $100 million. The money was not mine. The danger was. Someone followed me from the courthouse 2 nights later. The car remained behind me through 6 turns and disappeared when I drove toward a police station. My apartment building reported a man claiming to be an insurance inspector. Mara arranged security, and I moved temporarily into a furnished unit owned by the trust. My mother visited the museum. I was in the conservation lab, repairing a water-damaged ledger from a defunct textile mill, when my supervisor called to say a family member was causing a disturbance. Elaine stood in the gallery beneath a suspended airplane, dressed in black as though attending a second funeral. Visitors pretended not to watch. She said the lawsuit was killing Grandpa's company. I told her Raymond's decisions were killing it. She said families handled mistakes privately. I asked whether she considered breaking into the Mercer Street chamber a mistake. She did not deny her role. Instead, she said Grandpa had hidden what belonged to his children and forced them to protect themselves. There it was again, possession presented as self-defense. She told me she had spent her life being overlooked while Grandpa admired Raymond's ambition. She believed the hidden fortune was proof that he had planned one last humiliation for all of them. I understood more than I wanted to. My mother had built her identity around receiving visible signs of her father's approval. The lake house mattered because guests could see it. A trust devoted to workers and old buildings felt like love diverted away from her. Understanding did not make her actions harmless. I asked why she had supported declaring him incompetent. She said he was sick. I asked why she had searched my apartment. Her eyes moved toward the damaged ledger on my work table. That was the closest she came to admitting it. She said she only wanted to keep me from making an irreversible mistake. I told her entering my home had been irreversible. She began crying, quietly at first. When I did not comfort her, anger replaced the tears. She said I had always punished people by being calm. In her version of our family, refusing to join the chaos was an act of aggression. Before she left, she told me Derek knew more about Grandpa's final months than I did. The statement was intended as a threat. It became a lead. Derek had managed technology and security for Vail & Sons. Our auditors examined access logs from Grandpa's home and found that his office computer had been remotely monitored. Software installed under a company support account captured documents and emails. Derek knew Grandpa had amended the trust, but the attachment containing successor information was encrypted. That was why the family had focused on the key. They believed it contained or led to the password. The monitoring also explained Grandpa's behavior. Any message he wrote at home could be read. He communicated with Mara through handwritten notes carried inside archival supply orders delivered to the museum. I had unknowingly transported 2 of them after visiting him. He chose the rusty key because it pointed to a physical history that could not be understood from stolen emails alone. Derek's surveillance crossed from family misconduct into criminal territory. When confronted by counsel, he blamed Raymond. Raymond blamed a security vendor. The vendor produced Derek's signed instructions. The balance shifted. The board accepted our restructuring proposal on day 19, hours before a scheduled hearing. Raymond resigned but refused to attend the signing. Derek was terminated for cause. Isabel became interim chief executive. The trust took control without shutting a warehouse or missing payroll. I expected relief. Instead, I felt exhausted and vaguely disloyal. Grandpa had built the company with his hands. I had removed his son from it less than 3 weeks after the funeral. The facts justified every step, but facts do not silence old training. I could still hear my mother telling me that a good daughter preserved peace. I could still picture family holidays that would never happen again, even though most of those holidays had required someone quieter to absorb the damage. Isabel gave me a tour of the largest distribution center after the announcement. Employees had heard rumors that the company would be sold. A forklift operator named Ben asked whether he should cancel his daughter's college deposit. A purchasing manager showed us supplier accounts on hold. In the break room, someone had taped Grandpa's obituary beside the time clock. Those people were the answer to my guilt. The family had treated the company as a stage for inheritance. For everyone else, it was rent, medication, tuition, and retirement. Preserving peace at the top would have transferred the cost downward to people who had never entered the fight. We stabilized the company over the next 3 months. Isabel closed 2 vanity developments, renegotiated bank debt, and ended Derek's conflicted contracts. Caroline repaid $418,000 to the foundation by selling jewelry and a vacation property. No criminal referral was made for those expenses because the settlement recovered the funds and imposed permanent governance restrictions. The computer monitoring and attempted transfer remained under investigation. Raymond filed a lawsuit challenging the trust. He claimed Ruth Mercer had been mentally incapable when she established it, and that Grandpa had exercised undue influence. The accusation was both cruel and strategically foolish. In the hidden archive, Ruth had preserved carbon copies of correspondence, audio recordings dictated for her attorney, and detailed minutes of business meetings. Her records showed that she designed the structure, negotiated its terms, and repeatedly stopped Samuel Vail from raiding it. She had anticipated that future men might erase her role, so she documented it with an archivist's obsession. The fortune no one knew existed came with its own witness. I spent weeks cataloging Ruth's papers with the museum's permission and a team of independent conservators. Her voice emerged from the pages. She was sharp, impatient, and funny in the margins. She described my grandfather as promising but sentimental, and Samuel as a weather vane dressed in a necktie. She recorded every loan, every property purchase, and every promise made to employees who accepted reduced wages during the 1974 crisis. The trust was not a secret pile of gold, it was a delayed repayment. Ruth had written that if the business recovered, its prosperity should remember the people who financed survival with their patience. Grandpa spent 50 years honoring that sentence. Raymond withdrew his lawsuit after our attorneys disclosed the archive inventory. Continuing would have placed Ruth's records, the unauthorized guarantees, and his attempt to breach the chamber into the public court file. He accepted a settlement, surrendering most of his remaining shares and acknowledging the trust's validity without admitting fraud. Derek was charged 6 months later with unlawful computer access and attempted wire fraud. He accepted a plea agreement that avoided prison but included home confinement, restitution, and a prohibition on serving as an officer of any company handling client funds. My mother said I could have stopped it. I reminded her that I was not the prosecutor and had not installed the software or ordered the transfer. She did not speak to me for almost a year. Caroline surprised me. After the settlement, she resigned from the foundation and took a job at a nonprofit where she did not control the budget. She sent me quarterly repayment confirmations even after the amount was satisfied. We were not close, but she stopped pretending accountability was persecution. Sometimes that is the nearest a family gets to an apology. Vivian volunteered at the original store after we reopened it as the Ruth Mercer Center for Trades and Preservation. The ground floor became a public exhibit about the city's industrial history. The upper floors housed apprenticeship classrooms. We preserved the basement chamber behind glass, including Cabinet 11 and the lock the rusty key once opened. The cabinet contained no cash when it was returned. That disappointed visitors who preferred the fairy tale. Inside were reproductions of Ruth's first restructuring plan, employee promissory notes, and the trust's original deed. A small plaque explained that the most valuable thing stored there had been proof. I kept the original key. As trustee, I could have drawn a large salary. I chose one comparable to the museum director's and remained part-time in conservation. The trust purchased endangered historic buildings, funded pensions for early Vail & Sons employees, and created a loan program for tradespeople who could not obtain conventional financing. We made mistakes. Some projects failed. Stewardship did not become easy merely because the villains were removed. The family company recovered slowly. It became smaller, less glamorous, and profitable. Employee representatives received 2 board seats. Executive bonuses were tied to cash flow and safety rather than revenue alone. On the first anniversary of the restructuring, the company issued no press release. It simply made every supplier payment on time. That achievement would never appear in a fairy tale, but I found it beautiful. My mother eventually requested a meeting at the lake house. She had been forced to sell it because the unauthorized loan exceeded what she could repay. Under the estate agreement, the sale proceeds satisfied the lender, leaving her enough to buy a smaller home. She blamed me until her own attorney explained that the debt existed before I became trustee and that the trust had actually prevented Raymond from pledging the property again. We met on the empty back porch while movers carried furniture through the house. She looked older. So did I. She asked whether Grandpa had loved me more than the rest of them. For months I had imagined telling her yes. I wanted one clean victory after a lifetime of being the practical daughter, the forgettable granddaughter, the person expected to understand. But Ruth's papers and Grandpa's notes had taught me that inheritance was a poor language for love. People used property to translate emotions, then blamed the objects for saying the wrong thing. I told her he trusted me with a particular job. That was not the same as loving me more. She asked whether he trusted her at all. I said he had left her the lake house without restrictions. He had trusted her to decide what it meant. She looked toward the water and understood, perhaps for the first time, that receiving exactly what she demanded had not been the endorsement she imagined. My mother apologized for entering my apartment. The apology was narrow and carefully worded. She did not apologize for helping Raymond pursue the chamber or for calling my work insignificant all those years. I accepted only what she offered. Restoring a damaged relationship, like restoring paper, requires resisting the urge to paint over missing sections. We speak now. We are not healed in the miraculous way stories often require. She visits the Mercer Center and sometimes introduces me as its founder, which is inaccurate but well-intended. I correct her every time. Ruth founded the idea. Grandpa protected it. I inherited the obligation. 2 years after the will reading, Mara invited the surviving beneficiaries back to her office. Grandpa had instructed her to deliver personal letters once the trust dispute ended. The room was smaller than I remembered. Raymond did not attend. Derek joined by video under the terms of his home confinement. Caroline sat beside Vivian. My mother chose the chair next to mine, but left space between us. Each letter contained something different. Grandpa told Caroline that generosity without restraint could become theater. He told Derek that intelligence was not permission. He told my mother that being seen was not the same as being valued. He told Raymond that a family name was a loan from the dead, not a receipt of ownership. My letter was only 1 page. He wrote that he was sorry the key would make me a target. He had considered appointing an institution, but institutions preserve rules better than purposes. He needed someone who understood that damage should be examined before it was repaired, and that age alone did not make a structure worth saving. If Vale & Sons could not be made honest, I was to let it end. If the family could not forgive me for protecting what was not theirs, I was to let their approval end too. At the bottom, he added a final line: "The fortune is not what the key opens, it is what you refuse to lock away again." I read that sentence at the opening of the Ruth Mercer exhibit. The press still preferred the key. Photographers asked me to hold it beside my face. Television producers proposed documentaries with titles about secret millions. I declined most of them. The sensational version made Grandpa a magician and me a lucky granddaughter. It erased Ruth, the employees, the debts, and the long discipline required to keep wealth from becoming extraction. Once a year, however, I give the key to an apprentice at the center and ask what it was made to do. The answers are usually obvious. Open a door, secure a cabinet, protect something valuable. Then I show them the worn edges, the corrosion, and the number 11 nearly erased from the shaft. I explain that an object can perform more than one purpose across its life. This key once guarded documents. Later, it tested judgment. Now it helps tell a story about ownership, memory, and the people whose work disappears when powerful families write their own histories. One apprentice named Lila studied the key longer than anyone else. She was 19, recently out of foster care, and training in commercial carpentry through a scholarship financed by the trust. Instead of answering my question, she asked why Grandpa had allowed the metal to rust if the cabinet mattered so much. I told her he had probably stored it badly during the years when the chamber was damp. She shook her head and said, "People often cared for what was behind a lock while forgetting to care for the thing that let them reach it." Her observation stayed with me. Our new governance rules protected property, cash, and records, but people could still become mechanisms everyone relied upon and nobody maintained. We expanded counseling benefits, created paid training hours, and began interviewing retirees about decisions that never appeared in formal minutes. The changes were not dramatic enough for headlines. They were simply ways of caring for the keys before corrosion made them fail. That was when I understood why Grandpa had chosen an object that looked worthless. A polished gold key would have announced importance. The rusty one required attention before admiration. It rewarded the person willing to ask what remained beneath the damage. For most of my life, I had wanted my family to recognize that quality in me. After everything that happened, I no longer needed them to. I had learned to recognize it in myself and, more importantly, in other people. On the 3rd anniversary of Grandpa's death, I visited his grave before sunrise. I brought no flowers because he disliked watching them die in containers. I carried the rusty key in my coat pocket. Vale & Sons had just completed its strongest quarter in a decade. The trust had restored 6 buildings and issued 43 small business loans. Ben's daughter was finishing her 2nd year of college. The former lake house belonged to a family with 3 children who used the white sofas without fear. Raymond lived in Florida and sent the board long letters nobody was required to follow. Derek had begun doing bookkeeping for a landscaping company owned by a man who reviewed every transaction personally. None of it was perfect. That mattered to me. Perfection is often another way families hide the repair work. I sat beside Grandpa's stone and told him the company had survived. I told him Ruth's name was on the building. I told him my mother and I were trying. The cemetery was empty, so I allowed myself to say the thing I had resisted since the bank conference room. I wished he had trusted me enough to tell me while he was alive. The key felt heavy in my palm. His plan had protected the trust, but it had also made me solve his love like a puzzle while grief was still fresh. I could honor his foresight without pretending it had cost nothing. Stewardship meant preserving the truth, including the inconvenient parts of the people we admired. I returned the key to my pocket and walked back toward the gate as the sun reached the tops of the trees. At the will reading, my family believed I had received the smallest inheritance. For a few minutes, I believed it too. They saw rust, an obsolete object, and a condition designed to make me fail. What the key opened was worth more than every house and account named that day, but the money was only the surface of it. It opened the history my family had buried. It opened a company before its corruption could finish destroying it. It opened 900 livelihoods to a future that did not depend on one man's pride. And it opened a version of my own life in which being careful was not weakness, being overlooked was not the same as being insignificant, and refusing to take what belonged to others was its own form of power. The key is still rusty. I have never cleaned it. Some damage should remain visible, not because it defines the object, but because it proves what the object survived.